The metal barrel of the Thompson submachine gun caught the reflection of the stage lights, gleaming like a serpent's eye in the smoky haze of the club. It was pointed directly at the chest of the greatest musician on earth. Louis Armstrong was sweating, but not from the heat of the lights. He was sweating because he had just played the song "I'll Be Glad When You Re-Dead, You Rascal You" for the 45th time in a row. His lips were swollen. His fingers were cramping so badly they felt like claws. But every time he tried to lower his trumpet, every time he tried to signal to the band that it was over, the man in the front row, a massive, drunken gangster with a scar running down his cheek, would simply tap the barrel of the machine gun against the table and slur two words: "Play it." Again. The audience was frozen. The waiters were hiding in the kitchen. And Louis Armstrong, the king of jazz, realized with terrifying clarity that he was not playing a concert anymore. He was playing for his life. If he missed a note, or if he stopped before the man was satisfied, the most famous trumpet in the world would be silenced by a hail of .45 caliber bullets. But what Louis did not see, what he could not see from the blinding glare of the spotlight, was the movement in the shadows of the balcony above him. While he was blowing his soul out to keep a madman happy, the Chicago outfit was preparing a response that would turn that nightclub into a slaughterhouse. The song was about to end, but the violence was just beginning. To understand how a national treasure ended up held hostage by a Tommy gun, you have to peel back the glitter of the jazz age and look at the rot underneath. We like to think of the Roaring Twenties as a time of flappers and champagne, but in Chicago, it was a war zone. The city was carved up like a Thanksgiving turkey between rival warlords. On the south side, you had Al Capone and his Italians. On the north side, you had Bugs Moran and his Irish crew. And in the middle, caught in the crossfire, were the jazz clubs. These clubs were not just venues, they were neutral ground, cash cows, and sometimes battlefields. The gangsters owned the beer, they owned the buildings, and they owned the performers. Louis Armstrong was not just an artist to them. He was an employee. He was a high-value asset on the ledger of the mob. But being an asset of Al Capone did not make you safe. It made you a target. And on this particular night, Louis was about to learn that when you dance with the devil, you do not get to pick the tune. The night had started normally enough. The club was the Sunset Cafe, or perhaps the Savoy. The legends vary on the location, but the terror remains the same. It was packed. The air smelled of expensive perfume, illegal gin, and stale cigarette smoke. Louis was in his prime. He was hitting notes that did not technically exist on the trumpet, bending sound in a way that made grown men cry. He was the master of the universe. But the energy in the room shifted the moment the doors swung open and the guerrillas walked in. That's what they called them back then. Not the animals, but the heavy enforcers. These were not the smooth, suit-wearing wise guys. These were the bruisers, the men sent to break legs and send messages. They pushed their way to the front table, knocking over drinks, disrespecting the regulars. The leader of this pack was clearly high on something more potent than alcohol, likely cocaine or morphine, which fueled the recklessness of the lower-level hitmen. He slammed his Tommy gun onto the table, not caring who saw it. In 1920 Chicago, a machine gun on a table was not a crime. It was a form of identification. Louis saw them. He felt the cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. He knew who they were. They were North Side boys, rivals to the people who signed his checks. He knew he should probably pack up and leave, but you do not walk off stage when a killer is watching. You smile. You entertain. You pray they get bored and leave. But they did not leave. The leader fixed his glassy eyes on Louis and shouted for a specific song. A song about death. You rascal you. It was a taunt. Louis played it. The crowd applauded nervously. The gangster did not clap. He just pointed the gun and said, "Again." Louis played it again. And again. By the 20th time, the novelty had worn off. The crowd was silent, terrified. The band members were looking at the exits. The drummer was trembling so hard he could barely keep the beat. But the gangster was in a trance, lost in a loop of chemical madness and power. He was holding the entire room hostage with a look. But here is where the story gets darker. This was not just a random act of drunkenness. There is a theory among historians that this was a test. The North Side gang wanted to see if Capone could protect his people. They were poking the bear. By humiliating Armstrong, they were spitting in Al Capone's face. They wanted to see if the big fellow would react. Louis, standing there with his lip splitting and blood trickling into the mouthpiece, was just a pawn in a game of chess played with lead and blood. He was wondering where his protection was. Where were the boys? Where was the security? He felt abandoned. He felt like a court jester dancing for a king who was about to execute him. As the 45th rendition of the song began, Louis' vision started to blur. He was running out of oxygen. He was running out of strength. He looked at the gangster, hoping to see a shred of humanity, but he only saw the blank stare of a shark. The gangster's finger was resting on the trigger guard, tapping it. Top, top, top. It was a countdown. Louis knew that if he stopped playing, the silence would be filled by the roar of the gun. He had to keep playing to stay alive. It was the ultimate endurance test. But unbeknownst to Louis, the signal had already been sent. A busboy had slipped out the back door 10 minutes earlier. A phone call had been made. And miles away, at the Metropole Hotel, a group of men in silk suits had stopped eating their pasta, wiped their mouths, and stood up. They did not grab coats. They grabbed violin cases. The cavalry was coming, but the question was, would they arrive before Louis' lungs collapsed, or before the gangster decided he wanted to hear a different kind of music? The tension in the room was suffocating. A woman in the back sobbed quietly, and her husband covered her mouth. The gangster heard it. He spun around in his chair, swinging the barrel of the gun toward the audience. "Quiet," he screamed. "I'm listening to the man." In that split second, Louis saw his chance. He could run. He could dive behind the piano. But he did not. He knew that if he ran, the gun would turn on the crowd. He was the lightning rod. As long as he played, the gun stayed on him. So, he took a deep breath, ignored the pain in his chest, and blew the first note of the 46th round. It was a note of pure defiance. It was the sound of a man refusing to break. But he could not keep it up forever. He needed a miracle. And that miracle was currently speeding down Michigan Avenue in a black Cadillac with the headlights off. We are about to witness one of the most tense standoffs in the history of show business. But before the doors kick open and the bullets start flying, I have a question for you. We have a massive community here, people from every corner of the globe who love this history. I check the analytics, and I see you guys watching from everywhere. I want to know where you are representing. Drop your city and country in the comments below. Are you watching from the streets of Chicago? Or from London? Or Tokyo? Let me know down below. And while you read there, hit that like button if you think Louis Armstrong was the bravest musician who ever lived. Now, let's go back to that smoke-filled room, where the song was finally about to end. The black Cadillac moved through the Chicago streets like a shark through dark water. Inside, 4 men sat in silence. They were known as the Sanitation Department of the South Side Mob, a specialized crew tasked with cleaning up messes that threatened Al Capone's business interests. And tonight, the mess was a drunken North Side gunman threatening the most profitable asset in the city. The man in the passenger seat, a cold-eyed enforcer named Frankie the Rio, checked the load on his pistol. He did not care about jazz. He did not care about art. He cared that the Sunset Cafe was supposed to be a protected zone, a place where the money flowed up, not out. But what Frankie did not know was that the gunman inside was not working alone. There was a second man in the club, a spotter hiding in the crowd, and he had his hand on a grenade. Back inside the club, Louis Armstrong was reaching the limits of human endurance. His lips were bleeding. The metallic taste of brass and blood filled his mouth. He had played the same upbeat, frantic song 46 times. It was a torture technique usually reserved for prisoners of war, not musicians. The gangster in the front row was swaying, his eyes half closed, lulled into a stupor by the repetition. But the barrel of the Tommy gun never wavered. It remained fixed on Louis' heart. The band members behind Louis were practically fainting from exhaustion. The drummer had stopped playing the full beat and was just tapping the rim of the snare, terrified that any sudden movement would trigger a massacre. Louis looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:14 a.m. He wondered if he would live to see 2:15, or if his life would end in a flash of muzzle fire before the minute hand moved. Suddenly, the gangsteress mood shifted. The chemical cocktail in his blood turned from euphoric to paranoid. He blinked, shook his head, and stood up, knocking his chair over. The crash echoed like a gunshot. The audience gasped. The gangster looked around the room, his eyes wild. "Stop!" he screamed. The music died instantly. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. "You think this is funny?" the gangster shouted, waving the gun at the terrified patrons. "You think I'm a clown?" He turned back to Louis. "You. Come here." Louis froze. This was it. The execution. He slowly lowered his trumpet and took a step forward, his legs trembling. But just as the gangster raised the barrel to Louis' forehead, the service doors to the kitchen swung open. It was not a dramatic kick. It was a smooth, calculated entry. Frankie Rio and his 3 men walked into the room. They were not running. They did not have their guns drawn yet. They walked with the casual arrogance of men who owned the building, the block, and the police precinct. They spread out, moving through the shadows of the tables, flanking the stage. The Northside gunman, focused on Louis, did not hear them over the pounding of his own heart. He was too busy enjoying his power trip. He did not see the Sanitation Department closing the net. He did not realize that he had gone from being the hunter to being the bait in a trap that was about to snap shut. Frankie Rio stopped 10 feet away from the gunman. He lit a cigarette. The sound of the lighter striking was the only noise in the room. The gunman spun around, the Tommy gun swinging wildly. He saw Frankie. He recognized him. The color drained from his face. In Chicago, everyone knew Frankie Rio. If Frankie was there, Al Capone was watching. "That's a nice typewriter you got there, kid," Frankie said, gesturing to the machine gun. His voice was calm, almost bored. "But you replaying it a little loud. The neighbors are complaining." The gunman's hand shook. "Back off, Rio. I'll cut him in half." "I swear I'll do it." He swung the gun back toward Louis. Louis closed his eyes. He felt the heat of the standoff. "You could do that," Frankie said, taking a step closer. "But then you have to deal with us. And I do not think you have enough bullets for everyone." This was the pivot point. The psychological game. Frankie was betting that the gunman was a coward who hid behind a weapon. He was giving him an out. Or so it seemed. But Frankie had signaled his men. They were not looking at the gunman. They were scanning the crowd, looking for the backup. And sure enough, in the back booth, a man stood up nervously, his hand in his coat pocket. The spotter. The second threat. The situation had just doubled in complexity. If the spotter pulled the pin on a grenade or started shooting, the club would turn into a bloodbath. "Put the gun on the table," Frankie commanded, his voice dropping an octave. "And you can walk out of here. Al is feeling generous tonight." The gunman hesitated. He looked at Louis, then at Frankie, then at the exit. He was sobering up fast. He knew he was outgunned. He slowly lowered the Tommy gun toward the table. The audience let out a collective breath. It looked like it was over. But then, the spotter in the back made a move that turned a negotiation into a war zone. He panicked. He drew a revolver and fired a shot at the ceiling to create a distraction. The sound was deafening. The truce shattered. The gunman at the stage jerked the machine gun back up, his finger tightening on the trigger. Louis Armstrong dove behind the piano just as the wood splintered above his head. The air filled with smoke, screams, and the roar of automatic fire. The concert was over. The battle for the Sunset Cafe had begun. And Louis, huddled on the floorboards, hugging his trumpet like a child, realized that the mob had not come to save him peacefully. They had come to exterminate the infestation, and he was caught directly in the crossfire. Louis Armstrong pressed his face into the dusty floorboards behind the upright piano, covering his head with his hands as the world above him disintegrated. The sound of a Tommy gun in an enclosed space is not just a noise. It is a physical pressure that rattles your teeth. Bullets chewed through the mahogany casing of the piano, sending showers of wood chips raining down on Louis' tuxedo. He was inches away from death. If the gunman had aimed 2 inches lower, the history of jazz would have ended right there on that beer-stained stage. But the gunman was distracted. He was swinging the heavy weapon wildly, trying to hit the shadows moving toward him. Frankie Rio and his team did not panic. They moved with the cold precision of executioners. While the crowd screamed and scrambled for the exits, overturning tables and smashing bottles, the Southside enforcers advanced. They knew something the gunman did not. A Tommy gun climbs when you fire it on full auto. You lose accuracy. A pistol in a steady hand is worth 10 machine guns in a shaking one. 2 shots rang out from the darkness near the kitchen. They were distinct, sharp cracks that cut through the roar of the automatic fire. The spotter in the back booth, the man who had started the panic, crumpled onto the table, his revolver clattering to the floor. Threat 1 was neutralized. Now, all attention turned to the stage. The main gunman's weapon clicked dry. The magazine was empty. In the sudden, ringing silence, he frantically tried to reload, his hands fumbling with the drum. It was too late. Frankie Rio stepped into the spotlight, his pistol raised. He did not fire. He did not need to. He simply walked up to the stage, grabbed the hot barrel of the machine gun, and yanked it out of the man's hands. Then, with a casual brutality that shocked everyone watching, he pistol-whipped the gunman across the face. The man went down like a sack of cement. But the night was not over. The violence had stopped, but the real work, the work that keeps the mob in power, was just beginning. The lights in the club flickered back on fully. The scene was a disaster. Broken glass, overturned chairs, sobbing patrons huddled under tables. Frankie Rio looked around, assessing the damage. He signaled to his men. 2 of them grabbed the unconscious gunman by his ankles. They did not call an ambulance. They did not wait for the police. They dragged him toward the back exit, his head bouncing on the floor. Where they took him, nobody knows for sure. Some say he ended up in the Chicago River. Others say he was sent back to the North Side in a trunk as a message to Bugs Moran. But one thing was certain. He never pointed a gun at a musician again. Frankie holstered his weapon and walked over to the piano. He looked down behind it. "You can come out now, Satchmo," he said. "Show us over." Louis slowly stood up. He brushed the sawdust off his jacket. He was shaking so hard he could barely stand. He looked at Frankie, the man who had just saved his life, and he saw a monster. Frankie was not out of breath. He was not scared. He looked like he had just finished filing his taxes. "You okay, kid?" Frankie asked. Louis nodded, unable to speak. His throat was dry as sand. Frankie reached into his pocket, pulled out a wad of cash, $100 bills, thick as a brick, and stuffed it into Louis' pocket. "For the overtime," Frankie said. "Go home. Get some sleep. We'll handle the cops." And that was the moment Louis realized the true cost of his survival. He had not just been saved, he had been bought. The police arrived 10 minutes later, sirens wailing, long after the Sanitation Department and their prisoners had vanished. The officers walked into the club, saw the bullet holes, saw the terrified staff, and did absolutely nothing. The captain on the scene took one look at the manager, who whispered a few words in his ear, likely the name Capone, and the investigation was effectively closed before it opened. The official report would say it was a disturbance. No arrests. No suspects. The Chicago outfit had scrubbed the timeline clean. To the outside world, nothing happened. But to Louis, everything had changed. He went home that night, stared at his trumpet sitting in its case, and realized that his instrument was the only reason he was alive. But the psychological toll of that night did not fade with the sunrise. Louis started seeing shadows everywhere. He realized that he was just a prize poodle in a dogfight. The North Side gang had targeted him not because they hated his music, but because they wanted to hurt Al Capone's wallet. He was collateral damage in a war for territory. This realization changed his music. Listen to the recordings from this era. There is a frantic energy, a desperate joy in the high notes. It is the sound of a man playing as if every breath might be his last. Because for Louis Armstrong, it was not just a metaphor. He knew that the next time the doors swung open, Frankie Rio might not be there to stop the bullet. The Tommy gun incident solidified Louis' position in the hierarchy of the underworld. He was now officially protected property. This meant that no low-level thug would dare touch him. But it also meant he could not leave. He could not take a gig in New York or Europe without permission. He was a bird in a gilded cage, and the cage was guarded by men with machine guns. As the 1920s roared toward their crashing conclusion, the violence in Chicago escalated. The St. Valentine Day massacre was just around the corner. The streets were running red. And Louis knew that eventually, the luck of the draw would turn against him. He needed a way out. He needed an escape plan. And ironically, the only man who could help him escape the mob was a man who was even deeper in the mob than Al Capone. This brings us to the introduction of the most controversial figure in Louis' life, the man who would become his savior and his jailer, Joe Glaser. But before we meet the man with the plan, we have to see how Louis handled the fallout of the shooting, and why he decided to run. The decision to leave Chicago was not made in a boardroom. It was made in the back of a taxi speeding toward Dearborn Station with the headlights off. Louis Armstrong packed his life into 2 suitcases, his clothes in one, his trumpet in the other. He left the cash Frankie Rio had given him on the dresser. He did not want mob money. He wanted to breathe air that did not smell of gunpowder. He boarded a train bound for New York, watching the Chicago skyline fade into the gloom, believing that he was leaving the violence behind. But Louis made a fatal miscalculation. He thought that distance equaled safety. He did not realize that the mob was a national network, and he was simply trading a cage of lions for a pit of vipers. New York in 1929 was the jazz capital of the world. Harlem was booming. To Louis, it looked like paradise. He landed a gig at Connius Inn, one of the premier clubs. The crowds were bigger, the applause was louder, and the money was cleaner, or so it seemed. For a few months, Louis felt the tension in his shoulders relax. He was not looking for Frankie Rio in the shadows. He was not waiting for a Tommy gun to appear on a table. He was just playing. But the music business in New York had a dark underbelly, and its name was Arthur Fliegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz. If Al Capone was a businessman who used violence as a tool, Dutch Schultz was a psychopath who used violence as a hobby. And Dutch had decided that he was going to be the new owner of Louis Armstrong. The honeymoon period ended abruptly one Tuesday afternoon. Louis was rehearsing when a messenger arrived. No guns, no threats, just a simple invitation to visit the Dutchman's office. Louis went, thinking it was a booking inquiry. He walked into a room that smelled of stale beer and cheap cigars. Dutch Schultz did not stand up. He sat behind a desk, cleaning his fingernails with a switchblade. He looked at Louis with dead, shark-like eyes. "You a good blower," Dutch said, using the slang for a trumpet player. "But you have bad management. From now on, you work for me. You play where I tell you. You record what I tell you. And the money comes to me first." Louis tried to be diplomatic. He tried to explain he had contracts, obligations. Dutch stopped cleaning his nails. He looked up. "I do not care about paper, kid. I care about territory. You are in my territory. That makes you mine." Louis walked out of that meeting shaking. The nightmare had followed him. He realized that in America, a black man with talent was viewed as a commodity, like a crate of bootleg whiskey. He was not a person. He was property to be seized. But the real terror came a week later, when Louis tried to resist. He played a gig at a rival club, trying to assert his independence. The next morning, he received a message that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was not a letter. It was a visit from one of Dutch's enforcers, a man known for his cruelty. The enforcer cornered Louis in his dressing room, pushed him into a chair, and held a razor blade inches from his face. "Dutch is unhappy," the enforcer whispered. "He likes your music. But he says if you play for anyone else again, I'm going to cut your lip off." The threat was specific, horrific, and brilliant. To a trumpet player, his lip is his life. His embouchure, the way his lips meet the mouthpiece, is the source of his genius. If you cut his lip, you do not just hurt him, you destroy his soul. You kill the music. Louis looked at the razor, then at his trumpet sitting on the vanity. He realized he was trapped. He could not run. Dutch had men everywhere. He could not fight. He was a musician, not a soldier. He needed a monster of his own. He needed someone who could stare down Dutch Schultz and make him blink. He needed the one man he had sworn to leave behind in Chicago. Desperation drove Louis to a payphone in a drugstore on 125th Street. His hands were trembling as he dialed the operator. He asked for a number in Chicago. He asked for Joe Glaser. Glaser was a paradox, the son of a doctor, Jewish, educated, but with a heart as black as coal. He ran the brothels and clubs for the outfit. He was Al Capone's friend. He was terrifying. But he had always liked Louis. "Joe," Louis whispered into the phone, "I'm in trouble. The Dutchman. He says he is gonna cut my lip." There was a long silence on the line. Then, Glaser's voice came through, rough and reassuring, like gravel crunching under tires. "Where are you, Louis?" "New York." "Get on a boat," Glaser said. "Go to Europe. Stay there until I tell you to come back. I'll handle Dutch." It was the second escape. Louis did not even pack. He grabbed his horn and ran for the docks. He boarded a steamer bound for London, fleeing his own country like a refugee. But as he watched the Statue of Liberty fade into the mist, Louis did not feel free. He knew that by calling Joe Glaser, he had signed a contract in blood. He had invited the Chicago mob to save him from the New York mob. He was trading a razor blade for a leash. He spent years in Europe, playing for kings and queens, being treated like royalty, but every night he waited for the telegram. The telegram that would tell him it was safe to return. The telegram that would tell him who owned him now. And when that telegram finally came, it would trigger a chain of events that would change the music industry forever. The king was coming home, but the castle had new guards. When the ocean liner docked in New York Harbor in 1935, Louis Armstrong did not walk down the gangplank, he crept. He scanned the crowd of reporters and fans, looking not for friendly faces, but for the glint of a sniperscope or the flash of a knife. He had been in exile for years, hiding in London and Paris, playing for royalty while looking over his shoulder. He knew that in the underworld, grudges do not have expiration dates. He expected to be met by Dutch Schultz's men. He expected to be dragged into a car. But instead of a hit squad, he saw a single man standing near the customs gate, a man built like a concrete block in a wool suit. It was Joe Glaser, and the look on Glaser's face was not one of fear. It was the look of a landlord waiting to collect rent. Glaser stepped forward, pushing through the crowd with the physical dominance of a silverback gorilla. He hugged Louis, a gesture that looked affectionate to the cameras but felt like a shackle to the musician. "Relax, Satchmo," Glaser whispered into his ear, his voice smelling of cigars. "The Dutchman is dead. I handled it. You belong to me now." The news was true. Dutch Schultz had been gunned down in a toilet in New Jersey, a hit ordered by the Commission, which we covered in the Bumpy Johnson story. But Louis knew that the death of one monster simply created a vacuum for another. By stepping off that boat and shaking Glaser's hand, he was finalizing the deal he had made over the phone years ago. He was trading the chaos of the streets for the order of the syndicate. The meeting that followed in Glaser's office was the birth of the modern music industry, and it was signed in blood and fear. Glaser laid it out simply. "I take 50%, he said. "I pay the bills. I book the gigs. I handle the mob. You just blow the horn." 50% was robbery. It was indentured servitude. But Louis looked at the scar on his lip, the phantom pain of the razor threat still lingering, and he nodded. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He handed his life over to Joe Glaser because Glaser offered the one commodity Louis could not buy anywhere else: invulnerability. But Louis did not realize that this protection would turn him into a prisoner in his own life, a man who could not buy a car or even get a divorce without his manager's permission. Glaser went to work immediately. He was a terrifying figure. He did not negotiate with club owners. He dictated terms. If a promoter in SD. Louis tried to stiff Louis on a fee, Glaser did not call a lawyer. He flew to SD. Louis walked into the promoter's office and physically threatened to throw him out the window. He carried a pistol. He had the private numbers of every mob boss from New York to Las Vegas. When Glaser said, "Louis plays here," the answer was yes, sir. He built a fortress around Armstrong. The Tommy gun incident stopped. The razor threat stopped. The world saw a happy, smiling musician spreading joy. They did not see the armed guards backstage. They did not see Glaser standing in the wings, watching every move, ensuring the asset was performing at peak efficiency. This era brought Louis unimaginable fame. He became the first black host of a national radio show. He was in Hollywood movies. He was the ambassador of jazz. But the psychological toll was immense. Louis was a man of deep dignity, yet he had to play the role of the submissive entertainer to survive. He had to suppress his anger. He had to smile when white hotel clerks told him he could not sleep in the rooms his talent paid for. And worst of all, he had to be grateful to Glaser. He called him Papa. He loved him. It was a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome. The captor had become the father figure. But the cracks in this relationship were starting to show. As the civil rights movement began to heat up, the friction between the black artist and his mob-connected master would lead to a confrontation that threatened to destroy the empire they had built. Glaser's control extended to Louis's personal life. When Louis wanted to marry Lucille Wilson, a dancer at the Cotton Club, he had to ask Glaser. Not for a blessing, but for permission. Glaser ran the numbers. He decided a stable marriage was good for the brand. He allowed it. He bought the house for them in Queens, but the deed was in the company's name. Everything Louis touched, ate, or drove belonged to the syndicate. He was the wealthiest black musician in the world, yet he walked around with no cash in his pockets, relying on Glaser for handouts like a child on an allowance. The golden handcuffs were locked tight, but they were comfortable handcuffs. Louis had survived the Tommy guns of Chicago and the knives of New York. He was alive. He justified the exploitation by looking at the alternative. His contemporaries, musicians who tried to stay independent, were dying broke, beaten by police, or addicted to heroin. Louis was safe. But safety is boring. Safety is quiet. And in the silence of his dressing room, looking in the mirror at the grey hairs appearing in his temples, Louis began to wonder if he had sold his soul too cheap. He was about to face a new kind of enemy, one that Joe Glaser could not beat up and Al Capone could not bribe. The changing tide of American history was coming for them both. As the 1950s approached, the dynamic began to shift. The FBI started investigating the mob's grip on the entertainment industry. They started asking questions about Joe Glaser. They wanted Louis to testify. It was the ultimate test of loyalty. If Louis talked, he would be free of Glaser, but he would be a dead man. If he stayed silent, he remained a slave. The pressure cooker was building, and the valve was about to blow. The man who survived a machine gun attack was about to find out that the pen of a federal agent is mightier than the sword, and far more dangerous to a legacy. The finale of this tragedy was approaching, and it would not end with a bang, but with a whisper in a hospital room. The 1960s were the twilight of the gods for the old guard. The era of the Tommy gun had been replaced by the era of the wiretap. The FBI was dismantling the Chicago outfit piece by piece, and the protection that Louis Armstrong had relied on for 40 years was becoming a relic of the past. But the bond between Louis and Joe Glaser remained unbreakable, hardened by decades of shared secrets and buried bodies. They were an odd couple, the black musical genius and the Jewish mob fixer, walking hand in hand toward the grave. But as 1969 approached, the invincible Joe Glaser finally met an enemy he could not intimidate, a massive stroke. The tank broke down. And Louis, the man who had been treated like a child by Glaser for half a century, rushed to the hospital to hold the hand of the man who owned him. The scene at Beth Israel Hospital was a tragic tableau of their entire relationship. Glaser lay in a coma, silent and helpless. Louis stood by the bed, weeping, whispering to him. He called him Papa. He told him he loved him. It was a moment of profound, confusing emotion. Louis knew this man was a monster. He knew Glaser had used violence to build their empire. But he also knew that without Glaser, he would have likely died in a pool of blood on the floor of the Sunset Cafe back in 1928. The Stockholm Syndrome was complete. Louis waited for a squeeze of the hand, a sign, anything. But there was nothing. The protector was gone. When Glaser died, Louis was devastated. But he also felt a flicker of hope. He believed that in death, Glaser would finally set him free. He expected that Glaser S. would transfer ownership of the Associated Booking Corporation to him. It was only fair. Louis was the company. He had built it with his lungs and his lips. He believed that the final act of the tough guy would be an act of love, a posthumous granting of independence. But the reading of the will revealed one final, devastating twist that would break Louis Armstrong's heart more than any romantic rejection ever could. Joe Glaser did not leave the company to Louis. He did not even leave him his own master tapes. True to his nature as a cold-blooded businessman, Glaser left the controlling shares of the agency to his dentist and his lawyer. In his final legal act, he treated Louis Armstrong not as a son, but as furniture. You leave your house to your family. You leave your assets to your business partners. And Louis was just an asset. The realization crushed him. He had spent his life under the protection of a man he thought was a father, only to find out he was just a favorite pet. The golden handcuffs had not been unlocked, the key had been thrown away. Louis entered the final 2 years of his life in a state of deep melancholy. The betrayal ate at him. The man who had survived the mob wars of Chicago, who had outlived Al Capone and Dutch Schultz, was finally brought down by a piece of paper. He continued to play, because that is what he did, but the spark was fading. His health collapsed. The heart that had pumped the rhythm of the jazz age was failing. On July 6, 1971, just 2 years after Glaser, Louis Armstrong died in his sleep. So, how do we judge this story? When you look back at the night in the Sunset Cafe, with the Tommy gun pointed at his chest, you see the pivot point of a life. The mob saved Louis Armstrong. They stepped in when the law would not. They gave him a career. They gave him wealth. They gave him a life. But they took his freedom. It was a deal with the devil, signed in the smoke of a Chicago nightclub. The legacy of Louis Armstrong is usually painted in bright colors. The smile, the handkerchief, what a wonderful world. But the real story is painted in the gray shades of noir. It is a story of survival in a hostile country. It is a story that proves that in America, talent is not enough. You need muscle. Louis Armstrong was a genius, but he was also a survivor of a war that most people did not even know was being fought. He played the trumpet with a gun to his head for 50 years, and he made it sound like joy. The Tommy gun is silent now. The gangsters are dead. The clubs are gone. But the music remains. And if you listen closely to those high notes, you can hear the desperation. You can hear the sound of a man playing for his life, praying that the song never ends, because he knows who is waiting for him in silence.